Sometimes we ask one another to pray for us when we've got that exam coming up that we're really dreading, or when we're in need and suffering, when we want people to pray for our healing, as we do each week here on a Sunday. Or those times when we're struggling with our faith and struggling to believe, and we share that burden with our fellow Christians, and we ask them to pray for us, and in their prayer we're united with them, and we seek closer communion too with God. And I was struck by this morning's gospel reading, and it made me think, I wonder what, if we were to leave church this morning and to bump into this chap Jesus, I wonder what our number one request would be for him to pray for about us. What would be the first thing that we'd say? Could you pray for me about this because I'm struggling with it, or I've got this thing coming up that I'm worried about, or whatever. We catch up with Jesus here just before his crucifixion. It's a bit strange this time after Easter, because we've celebrated the Passion, his death and resurrection 7 weeks ago now, and then we flip back in the Gospels and jump about a little bit, and here we are once again just before his crucifixion with Jesus and his disciples in the upper room. And this is a point at which he's kind of given up on teaching. He's done teaching and explaining to his disciples for 3 years what's going to happen. And my theory about Easter is that it's about actions and not about words. That Easter is the time when Christ acts on the things that he's been saying, realizing that it doesn't matter how many times he tries to drum it in to these thick-headed disciples, it's just not getting through. And here, this moment where you think, just before he goes to his death, he'd be giving them his final piece of teaching. Instead, he commits and spends this time in prayer, and he prays for those disciples and apostles who are there, and extraordinarily, he makes this prayer too for you and for me, as we read in that first line of the Gospel, those who will believe in me through their, that is the apostles' word. And we're them. 100 generations later, we are the people who have had our faith passed to us by those who've had their faith passed to them all the way backwards in an unbroken chain to those first disciples of Christ. And his prayer for us, I wonder how many of us this will match up with the thing that was top of our list when we meet Jesus outside the door. His prayer for us is that they may all be one. His prayer for us is unity. And immediately to our ears today, this sounds like a kind of ecumenical affirmation, that they may all be one, all of my disciples, all of my followers, that they may be one. It's a bit of a kind of anachronistic, a bit of a way of reading the future back into the past in that text. Because, of course, at the time that Jesus is speaking, there's no such thing as the church, let alone many warring factions within the church. By the time that John is writing this at the end of the first century, there's a real kind of hodgepodge of Christian Jews, people who were first and foremost Christian but continued following Jewish laws, Jewish Christians, people who saw Christianity as a natural evolving of their Jewish faith. There are Gentile Christians. There are people worshipping in synagogues, people in house groups. There are people still going to the temple to sacrifice despite their professing Christ. And whether this is John speaking these words to his own warring community, or whether this is Jesus with the foreknowledge that inevitably human nature will result in these, my disciples, becoming split, becoming at enmity with one another. Whichever it is, this is a prayer that was needed in the first century and is needed just as much now. That those who believe in me will be one. It also happens to fall at an amusing time this year, this gospel reading. Earlier this week on the 4th of May, we were celebrating in the church the English saints and martyrs of the Reformation. An exciting holiness, the big red book of saints. It offers this rather kind of tactful introduction to what this celebration is about. As the Reformation grew in strength, it says, it suffered its own internal struggles, with one group determined that they were the keepers of the truth and that all others were therefore at least in a state of ignorance and at worst heretical. In the 20th century, ecumenical links drew the churches closer to each other in faith and worship, and now all recognize both the good and the evil that evolved from the Reformation era. A carefully worded statement. And the English saints and martyrs of the Reformation include both those saints and martyrs of Protestant and Roman tradition. And it doesn't take an awful lot of digging through to find examples of the evil that that introduction mentioned. On the Protestant side, Hugh Latimer was one of the three Oxford martyrs. He was arrested and imprisoned for arguing against the doctrines of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and transubstantiation. And at the end of his trial, once the chief church prosecutor had sentenced him to death, he said to Latimer, "If you go to heaven in this faith, I will never come hither." And Latimer was burnt at the stake in Broad Street in Oxford, and you can still go and see a kind of copper plaque on the floor at the supposed place. And it's kind of bewildering to our modern mindset, where we are now in churches and teams where we are quite comfortable in the idea that people within a single church, let alone our national church or the Anglican Communion, will come with different understandings, different theologies and spiritual experiences of the Eucharist. And within the Anglican Communion, there are those who believe in transubstantiation and those who don't, certainly those who believe in the real presence of Christ at the Eucharist and those who don't. And the idea that, that this man who was prosecuting said to him, if you're welcomed into heaven believing these things that you believe, then I want no part of that heaven, is a kind of extraordinary enmity that is not as easy to imagine for us today. The martyrs were by no means simply on the Protestant side, many on the Roman Catholic side as well. John Payne, he was charged just up the road at Chelmsford, about 30 years after Latimer in 1582, for conspiring to murder the Queen, no less, and he was executed on the charge of treason. He'd never done any such thing, and the testimony that was given by one witness at his trial bore a remarkable resemblance to the testimony given at Edmund Campion's trial exactly 1 year earlier, who too was executed on the charge of treason for conspiring to murder the Queen. And perhaps the one that struck me as the most outrageous was another Catholic priest, Ambrose Barlow. He was celebrating the Eucharist with 100 of his congregation and parishioners on Easter morning, celebrating the resurrection of Christ to new life on Easter morning. And the local Protestant clergyman, the Vicar of Lee, armed his congregation of 400 people and surrounded the church. And it kind of is humorous and tragic in equal measure listening to it now. I never knew I had a kind of a standing army here, if only I brought the cudgels. But to imagine the thing that you thought was most appropriate to do on the Easter morn at the celebration of Christ's resurrection was to take up arms against fellow Christians and surround this place and arrest him and have him executed, is extraordinary. And then thinking on this, I thought that in their own very kind of misinformed and mistaken way, perhaps these people were sort of seeking for unity. Not unity as we think of it now, but rather some sort of rigid conformity whereby if you just executed enough of the people who thought some other way, all that you'd be left with would be those who thought exactly the same as you. I can hardly imagine that's what Christ is looking forward to when he prays that they may all be one. Instead, the unity of all people, despite their differences, their different approaches, their different theological and spiritual interpretations, must be at the heart of Christ's prayer. Now, sometimes I stand here and I challenge you, and maybe every now and then I berate you. I'm not terribly good at berating. I can't keep a straight face. But today, what I want to do is congratulate you and praise you and thank you, because for these last 2 years that I've been here, I've been so impressed by the ecumenical work that I've seen taking place here in our team and more broadly in CTED, in the Churches Together in Epping District. It's a lively organisation, it's well run. We as leaders meet together regularly from across diverse and broad traditions. We all share together in our Pentecost celebrations. In the last couple of years, they've been really fantastic, and we look forward to the celebration next Sunday at 4 o'clock outside the Methodist Church in Epping. We go on our walk of witness together on Good Friday. And what a testimony that is to those who see us walking through the centre of Epping town, that we as Christians, despite our differences, gather together and are in communion and solidarity with one another in seeking to proclaim Christ crucified. And we support one another at the week of prayer for Christian unity and the events that we put on at our churches. And of course, some of those things could be better attended. That's always true for any organisation putting any events on. But I've been really impressed. And at a local level, up at Epping Upland, with Epping Green Chapel just down the road, they meet together for their carol services in Advent. They meet together for the dawn service on Easter morning. They support one another's work. And the work of our team here, our team council, our ministers across the team, and our congregations, and what we share in. And I've heard one or two of the kind of horror stories, I suppose, of the early days of the construction of the team. And I'm so pleased that that hasn't been at all my experience, and that the team has been seeking to work and to minister together as effectively as we can as the unit that we are. And slowly but surely, we're putting together the mission and ministry unit that will remove the blinkers from not just our parochial borders or our team borders, but instead will get us looking as far as the churches in Thaden Boys and the Thaden Boys team in Waltham Abbey, and thinking about how we can most effectively make use of the ministry that we have here to bring Christian mission to those people in most desperate need of it, to share the good news of the gospel, not in some insular way to just those who we consider as our own, those inside our historic borders, but across borders, beyond church tradition, sharing the wonderful faith that we've received with those who are desperate to hear it. And of course the Anglican Communion as well, and I've probably had more frustrated words to say about the Anglican Communion than anything else, but I really wouldn't be without it. And I think about the links that we have here in Chelmsford with the churches in Kenya and the churches in Sweden and in Trinidad and Tobago. And what amazing experiences I've had when I've gone to visit some of those Christians, to be able to share in their very different lives, to be able to hear from their perspectives, to have one's own worldview kind of transformed by their experiences. And we are at a tenuous time in the Anglican Communion. No amount of fancy words hides the fact that things are desperately strained. And I have great sympathy with those who would see a split along certain doctrinal lines. But I think, moreover, my heart lies with unity and with what we can learn from one another despite our differences. And of course, we've got some way to go at a kind of national and international level with denominations. We long for that day when Roman and Orthodox and Protestant Christians will gather around one table again, worshipping one Lord, joining together in true communion. And I'm sure that someday Archbishop someone or other and Pope someone else and Metropolitan someone else will gather, and there'll be handshakes and there'll be photo opportunities and it'll be plastered all over the papers. But the reason that that will happen is that because for 50 years before that takes place, locally, churches will have been sharing with one another quietly, and not because any rules have been put into place, but just because they're wanting to offer hospitality and welcome and care for one another. And eventually the authorities, as they always do, will catch up and realise that the time for unity was 50 years ago, but they might as well do it now. And our unity is not just a nice thing for us to do. It's not just a kind of a polite thing or a civic responsibility and good behaviour as Christians. Our unity, the gospel informs us, is the sign to the world that Jesus Christ is God. It's our testimony to the world. And if that is our testimony, then our disunity is an even more powerful testimony. And this is the warning in all of this, that hypocrisy is not easy to live down. And as you heard from those martyrs of the Reformation era, we've got some serious history to put behind us and to make good on. And it only takes one moment for people to see and say, oh, look how these Christians are bad-mouthing one another, or how they can't even be friends, or they can't even show basic hospitality and welcome to each other. It just takes one example of that kind of hypocrisy to undo years of good work. And it's for the sake of Christ and for the sake of his gospel and for all those who've not yet come to know him that we seek unity, that we seek to fulfill his prayer that all may be one. And I just wanted to say to you today that over these last 2 years that I've seen the work that you've been doing. You've been doing a jolly good job, and keep up with it. Well done.